The navigation system on the Callaway had been wrong before, but it had never been wrong in a direction that resulted in armed boarding. That felt like an escalation. Darian Hale was midway through a container manifest check. Routine cargo, legal cargo, aggressively legal cargo. The kind of cargo a man carries when he is very aware that his ship has a complicated reputation and wishes to counteract this with paperwork. When the proximity alert activated, and the Callaway's ancient sensor array identified 4 vessels that had not been there 30 seconds ago. They were positioned in the specific geometric pattern that means you are surrounded in any language, and they were broadcasting on the standard hailing frequency in a way that did not suggest they were interested in small talk. Darian set down his manifest. He looked at the navigation display, which showed him precisely where it had told him he was going, which was through a perfectly standard transit corridor between 2 relay stations. He looked at the external feed, which showed him where he actually was, which was apparently inside a restricted Cathari sovereign zone, which was marked on every navigation chart he had ever used as a large, clearly colored area labeled "Do Not Enter" in 6 languages, one of which was his. "Callaway," he said to the ship's system, which had the voice of a mildly disappointed librarian. "Why are we here?" "Route optimization," the system said. "This is not optimized. Distance metrics were favorable. I'm being boarded." "Arrival was prompt," the system offered. Darian closed the manifest, straightened his jacket with the reflexive dignity of a man who knows appearances matter and has limited tools with which to maintain them, and went to open the docking hatch. The Cathari boarding team that came through it numbered 6, moved in a configuration that left him exactly no useful options, and communicated without words the specific message that this had happened before and was going to proceed efficiently. He was on Carathvel Station within 2 hours. The efficiency was, in its way, almost impressive. The tribunal chamber was carved from a dark stone material that absorbed light at the edges and gave the space a quality of deliberate gravity, as though the room itself had been designed to ensure that everyone inside it understood the weight of what occurred here. The walls were covered in the text of the Werk, column after column of it, rendered in a script that the translation collar at Darian's throat rendered as a low, continuous murmur of legalese that he found both helpful and deeply unsettling, like having a lawyer whisper directly into his nervous system. Arbiter Jael entered from a side door and took her position at the tribunal bench with the focused efficiency of someone who has done this many times and finds it, if not pleasant, at least precisely defined. She was tall, composed, and carrying the particular stillness of someone whose authority is so established that they no longer need to perform it. Her long ears were angled flat and backward, in a configuration Darian had read about in the minimal Cathari cultural briefing he'd managed to access on the transit over, and which the briefing described as controlled professional disapproval. It suited her. She reviewed the charges without looking at him. Unauthorized entry of sovereign corridor, failure to respond to initial hailing, presence of unregistered scanning equipment. This last one surprised Darian, because the scanner in question was a geological survey tool he had been carrying as a favor for a research station and had completely forgotten about, which he suspected was not going to be a compelling defense. "The Werk provides 3 options for your situation," Jael said, and the translation collar rendered her voice as low and even and carrying the precise weight of someone reading from a document that is not open to interpretation. "You will choose one." She listed them. The first was a standard detention period, 18 Cathari months on a supervised work installation, which his translation collar rendered in Earth Standard as approximately 2 years. The second was asset forfeiture, the Callaway, its cargo, and all registered equipment, in exchange for immediate release into non-Cathari space with a permanent transit restriction. The third was a punitive bond assignment to a labor collective for 1 Cathari cycle, the nature of which was described in terms that suggested it was the option presented when the tribunal wanted to make a point. Darian listened to all 3. He was quiet for a moment in the way that people are quiet when they are doing something more than waiting. His eyes moved along the wall text behind the tribunal bench, the columns of the Werk, dense and continuous. The translation collar murmured. He read. He found it in the bonding codex. Article 7. It was not highlighted, it was not presented, it was simply there in the wall because the Werk contained everything and made no editorial judgments about what should be prominent. He read it twice. Then he looked at Arbiter Jael, at her flat, backward ears, her composed expression, the absolute certainty in her posture that this proceeding was going to conclude in one of three ways, and that she was waiting only for him to select which one. "I'd like a moment," he said. "You have one," she replied, and the precision of that response, literally one moment, measured and granted, told him everything he needed to know about how the next part of this was going to land. He took a breath. He thought about the Callaway, which was old and wrong about directions and his, and about 2 years on a work installation, and about the particular quality of a legal system that is so comprehensive it contains its own escape routes without meaning to. "Article 7, he said, "Bonding Codex, I invoke a claim of pairing." The chamber went quiet in a way that chambers do not usually go quiet, not the quiet of a pause, but the quiet of a room that has been structurally altered by a single sentence. "With the commanding officer of this tribunal," he said. Jael's ears moved, not backward, fully, sharply sideways, a position his briefing had not covered, which he suspected meant the briefing had not anticipated a situation in which it would be necessary. She looked at him for a long moment with the expression of someone who has just found an error in a calculation they were certain was correct, and is now working backward through every step to find where it entered. "You understand," she said, with a quietness that was more alarming than volume would have been, "what you have just invoked." "Article 7, Bonding Codex," Darian said. "Claim of pairing with an unbonded commanding tribunal officer, transferring legal jurisdiction for a minimum of 1 full Cathari cycle." He paused. I read it twice to be sure. The silence that followed had texture and weight, and the specific quality of something that cannot be taken back. Senior advisor Ket had been practicing Cathari law for 31 years, and had, in that time, encountered situations that were complicated, situations that were unprecedented, and situations that were both. He had never encountered a situation that was both, and also somehow the defendant's fault in a direction he had not seen coming, and he was finding the experience instructive in ways he did not particularly welcome. He spent the first 3 hours after the tribunal's suspension searching the bonding codex for a counter-provision. He found several that were adjacent to useful, and none that were actually useful, because the Werk, in its comprehensive and entirely neutral wisdom, had written Article 7 without exception clauses, on the apparent assumption that no one would ever need one. He flagged 4 precedents, reviewed them, and set them aside because they involved entirely different circumstances and a different century. And one of them concerned a land dispute that was only tangentially related to bonding law in a way that required interpretive creativity he was not prepared to defend before a full council. Darian, in the holding room that was notably nicer than the one he had occupied before invoking Article 7, received 6 visitors in 4 hours. They arrived in sequence, each one slightly more senior than the last, and each one asked him a version of the same question. Did he understand what he had done? He said yes each time, which was true, and did not add that understanding and fully accounting for were different cognitive activities, which was also true and seemed less useful to mention. The 6th visitor was a young legal aide who had apparently drawn the short assignment and arrived looking like someone who would have preferred any other task. She sat across from him with a data pad and said, without preamble, "Arbiter Jael has accepted the provision." Darian looked at her. She accepted it. The Werk requires acceptance when the provision has been correctly invoked and all conditions are met. The arbiter is unbonded. She was the commanding officer of record. The invocation was procedurally correct. The aide looked at her data pad, then back at him, with the expression of someone delivering a weather report about whether she personally finds unreasonable. She is bound by the law she upholds. She accepted. He sat with that for a moment. He had known she would have to. He had read the provision carefully enough to understand that it was not optional. But knowing something intellectually and hearing it stated as completed fact occupied different rooms in the mind, and moving between them took a second. "How is she?" he asked. The aide blinked. It was clear that in the sequence of questions she had anticipated this had not appeared. "The arbiter," she said carefully, "is processing the situation with characteristic composure." That's a diplomatic way of saying something. "It is," the aide agreed, with an honesty that suggested she had also reached her limit for diplomatic phrasing and stood to leave. Darian leaned back in his chair and looked at the ceiling, which was carved stone like everything else on Carathvel and carried the same faint text of the Werk along its edges. as though the law wanted to be present in every direction a person might look. He thought about the Callaway. He thought about the fact that it was currently impounded in the station's docking bay, which meant it was not being operated by its navigation system, which meant it was, for the first time in recent memory, exactly where it was supposed to be. He thought about Jael's ears, that sideways movement, that position the briefing hadn't covered, and wondered what it meant in a language he was only beginning to learn. He thought, one Cathari cycle. Then he thought, start paying attention. The quarters assigned to Darien under bonding protocol were adjacent to Jael's own, separated by a shared common space that the station's residential system had furnished with the neutral precision of furniture that has been told to suggest cohabitation without implying anything about it. 2 chairs, a table, a viewport that looked out onto the station's inner ring where the slow commerce of Carathvel moved in its structured patterns below. Jael arrived in the common space on the first morning at exactly the time that bonding protocol required and not a moment before. She was in formal attire, which Darien understood was not for his benefit, but was simply how she operated, the way some people maintain structure as a form of self-respect rather than performance. She sat. She placed a data pad on the table. She looked at him with the specific expression of someone who has made a decision and is in the process of living with it at a constant low temperature. The protocol requires 4 hours of shared activity per day, she said. I intend to fulfill the requirement precisely. I do not intend to exceed it. That's fair, Darien said. She looked at him as though fairness had not been on the list of responses she had prepared for. I have questions, he said, about the Werk, if that's within the 4 hours. Questions about the Werk are permissible shared activity under bonding protocol, yes. Does everything in your life have a protocol? Yes, she said, without hesitation and without any indication that she found this unusual. It is, she added, after a pause that suggested she was deciding whether to continue, how things work correctly. Darien looked at the viewport. Below, a cargo vessel was being guided into a docking bay by 4 automated tugs, each one moving in the precise geometric pattern of the procedure. Nothing wasted, nothing uncertain. He thought about the Callaway and its optimistic navigation system and felt the distance between that world and this one as a physical thing. Article 7, he said. The claim of pairing, it's old. 140 years since last invocation. What happened then? Jael's ears moved slightly, not backward, not sideways, but a small downward angle he hadn't catalogued yet. A border dispute, 2 families. One invoked the claim to prevent a punitive judgment against their eldest. The bond held for 1 cycle, and both parties fulfilled its requirements. She paused. They remained bonded voluntarily afterward. It is considered, in legal history, a footnote. A footnote, he repeated. You are also currently a footnote. I've been called worse. Something moved across her face, brief, involuntary, gone before it fully arrived. Her ears returned to their neutral position. She looked at the data pad. They spent the 4 hours going through the Werk's bonding provisions, not because the protocol required it specifically, but because Darien kept asking questions and Jael kept answering them, and somewhere in the 2nd hour both of them had stopped tracking the time with the precision they had started with. He asked good questions. She had noticed this before and continued to notice it, and found it simultaneously useful and inconvenient. He asked about the law not as a system to be navigated, but as a thing that had been built by people for reasons, and he was interested in the reasons, which was not how people usually approached legal discussion in her experience. Why is there no exception clause in Article 7? He asked, near the end. She considered this. The original drafters believed that the Werk should contain no provisions that undermined themselves. An exception clause would imply that the provision could be misused. The drafters believed that a law correctly written would not be misused. They were wrong, Darien said. They were, Jael agreed, and her voice had something in it that was not quite wry but occupied the neighboring territory. You have demonstrated this comprehensively. To be fair, he said, my navigation system demonstrated it first. This time what moved across her face completed itself. Small, controlled, real. And her ears shifted upward by a degree that his developing understanding of Cathari expression was beginning to catalogue as something he didn't have a word for yet but wanted one. The 4 hours ended. She stood, picked up her data pad, and moved toward her door with the composure of someone returning to the structure of their life after a brief excursion outside it. At the door she stopped, without turning. Tomorrow, she said, the protocol begins at the same time. I'll be here, Darian said. She left. The common space held the shape of the conversation for a moment, the way rooms do after something real has occurred in them. And then it was just a room again, with 2 chairs and a table and a viewport looking out onto a world that ran on law and precision, and was currently containing, in its careful architecture, something it hadn't entirely planned for. The formal challenge was filed by Senior Council Member Voras on the 19th day of the bonding cycle, and it was, by any legal standard, a well-constructed argument. Voras had spent 40 years in Cathari jurisprudence, had authored 2 of the Verk's most recent amendment provisions, and had the measured confidence of someone who had never lost a council argument and did not expect to begin now. His position was simple. The claim of pairing in Article 7 was a provision written for cultural participants, for people who understood the bond's full weight within the context of Cathari society, who invoked it as a genuine cultural act rather than a legal maneuver. A human cargo runner who had read the provision off a wall in the 30 seconds between being given his options could not, by any reasonable interpretation, have understood enough to invoke it in good faith. The bond was therefore invalid. It should be annulled. The original charges should resume. It was a reasonable argument. Ket, reviewing it privately, thought it would probably succeed. Darian was informed of the challenge and given, through a legal liaison who delivered the information with the careful neutrality of someone who has been instructed not to editorialize, the option to support it, to stand before the council and agree that he had not fully understood, to accept a reduced sentence, 30 days supervised, transit restrictions lifted after 6 months, and walk away. He sat with this for a long time. Long enough that the liaison, who had expected an immediate answer, began to look uncomfortable. He thought about the 19 days, about the common space and the 4 hours and the questions and the answers and the way Jael's ears had moved on the day he asked about the exception clause. He thought about a legal system that was also a moral framework, that valued the integrity of its own provisions above the convenience of its outcomes. He thought about what it would mean to stand before the council and say he hadn't understood, and what it would mean to say he had. "I'm not going to support the challenge," he said. The liaison blinked. "You understand that without your support, the council will need to rely entirely on Arbiter Jael's testimony regarding the bond's validity, and her position is." "Complicated," Darian said. "Yes, I know." He appeared before the full council the following morning in a chamber larger than the tribunal room, with more wall text and more gravity and more senior officials, seated in a configuration that communicated, architecturally, that the individual standing in the center of it was expected to feel small. Darian felt reasonably sized, which he suspected was either composure or a failure of imagination, and didn't particularly care which. Voras presented the challenge with the precision of someone laying out a table setting, everything in its right place, the conclusion already visible in the arrangement of the components. He was persuasive. The council members' expressions suggested they found him persuasive. Darian listened to all of it with the attention he had learned in 19 days from watching someone who listened to everything. When it was his turn, he said, "I understood enough." He said, "I understood that the provision existed. I understood its requirements. I understood that the person I was invoking it with was someone who had built her life on the integrity of the law she upholds, and that invoking it meant she would have to honor it regardless of personal cost, because that is who she is. I understood that I was creating a problem for her. I chose to create it anyway because the alternative was worse for me, which is honest, and I think the Verk values honesty above procedure." He paused. "I also understood that I didn't want to be processed by a legal system and released into space and never have the conversation I was having. That part I understood completely." The chamber was quiet. Voras said with the careful precision of someone recalibrating, "That is not a legal argument." "No," Darian agreed, "but it's a true one." The council deliberated for 2 hours. Jael sat at the senior arbiter's bench throughout and said nothing, and her face revealed nothing, and her ears were in a position Darian had not seen before, perfectly, carefully neutral, which he had come to understand was the hardest position for them to hold and the one that required the most active maintenance. The challenge was denied. The bond stood. Afterward, the chamber emptied with the efficient dispersal of people who have delivered a verdict and have other things scheduled, and Darian stood in the thinning room and thought about what came next, which was still one Cathari cycle, still the common space, still 4 hours a day, and which had acquired in the last 19 days a texture that it had not started with. Jael found him in the corridor outside the chamber, which required her to have waited for him there, which was not required by any protocol. She was not in her formal posture. She was standing the way he had only seen her stand in the common space, when the data pad was closed and the session was technically over and they kept talking anyway. "You didn't take the offer," she said. "No." "Why?" He looked at her long ears, angled fully forward, unheld, unmanaged. In the position he had learned meant attention that had stopped pretending to be something more neutral. "Because it would have been dishonest," he said. "And the Verk values honesty above procedure. You told me that. I told you the Verk's founders believed that. I believed it too." She was quiet for a moment that had a different quality than her usual silences, less constructed, more inhabited. "What you said in there," she said, "about not wanting the conversation to end." "Yes, that was—" She paused, and the pause had the shape of someone translating, not between languages, but between what they think and what they're willing to say. "That was not a legal argument." "I know. It was," she said, carefully, quietly, with her ears fully forward and the corridor empty around them and the weight of the Verk on every wall. "Not an unwelcome one. It was not a declaration. It was not a resolution. It was the thing that exists before both, the atmospheric change before the weather, the frequency before it finds its ground." Darian stood in it for a moment and let it be what it was. "1 Cathari cycle," he said. "Yes. That's a long time for a conversation." Jael's ears rose, fully, steadily, in the position he had been cataloging for 19 days and had finally, today, found the word for. "It is," she said. "I intend to use it correctly." And in the corridor of a station built from law and certainty, and the long accumulated weight of what a civilization decides to protect, two people walked back toward a common space that had started as a protocol requirement, and had become, quietly and without anyone's permission, something they were both choosing, which was, under the Verk and outside of it, the only kind of bond worth keeping.